Good morning, everybody. Before we bring our first speakers on, welcome to day 2 of UKREiiF. You brought the weather with you again, which is excellent. Hope you're having a good time. We have another very busy day across our multiple stages. A quick health and safety for this particular room. There is no alarm test planned for today in the Armouries. If you do hear the alarm, it is for real. There are a number of exits here, some of them lit, others down the side. We'll just ask you to leave in an orderly fashion. So I'm going to leave you in the very capable hands of related Argent and this morning's panel. Enjoy. Thank you.
Yeah, we're on.
And how are you? You well? Yeah, long day yesterday.
At the far end is my podcast co-presenter, Rory Stewart. And we're going to go down what we've decided. These three, they're going to introduce themselves and they're going to make 1 point very briefly to start the debate, starting with Georgia Gould, leader of Camden Council.
I'm Georgia Gould, leader of Camden Council, chair of London Councils, and my point that I wanted to make is I think we as leaders of places, I can see lots of city leaders and local authority leaders in the room, are I think where the dynamism and the leadership is coming in this country. Local authorities are the most trusted part of government. We are bringing together new partners, leading missions-based change and regeneration and changing lives, but we're doing that with one hand tied behind our back because government has ripped out the capacity of local government over the last 12 years. We're seeing these short-term settlements. We have to bid against each other for tiny pots rather than giving us a long-term funding deal and the powers we need to really drive change in our places.
So Labour local government good, Tory national government bad. Okay?
Local government good.
Got it, yeah. Rob.
I'm Robert Evans. I'm a partner in related Argent. I'm going to make 2 actually very quick points. I'm going to cheat.
Against the rules.
The first is I'm an ex-failed planner, so I'm going to say please don't knock the planning system. It can actually do great things. Planners and planning isn't the problem in the room. So that's my one. The other is about funding. Yeah, we need a sort of more longer-term approach to funding everything, basically, and that's something we might turn to.
Okay, Abby.
Hi, I'm technically still leader of Stoke-on-Trent City Council. I'm Abby Brown, but I'm actually here in the capacity as LGA chairman of the Innovation and Improvement Board. Stoke-on-Trent is a fantastic city and we've done brilliant things over the last few years and great things moving forward in the future. And I would say that the agency of local government and its innovativeness has not been recognised by government, and there's plenty more to build on there, and the government needs to spend more time talking to us about the things that Georgia mentioned to see how we can unleash our economies.
Can I begin by asking about the public, and this is particularly to the council leaders. What do you think the public often doesn't understand about your jobs and the challenges of your jobs? What frustrations do they feel when they are looking at you?
So I'd say today, because I'm looking for a job, that you're not terribly well paid as a councillor.
Bloody electorate.
Yeah. But the councils are the glue that stick places together. You know, we do everything that you can think of. You know, when you knock on somebody's door and they say the council never does anything for me except switch the street lights on, make sure your road's okay, give you a book to borrow if you need to from the library, provide a school if you need one, look after you at either end of the spectrum of your life if you need support, and all that sort of stuff. I don't think the public have any idea around our roles.
And Georgia, what do you think the public doesn't get about planning and development? What are the sort of things that you often hear in meetings which frustrate you and you're struggling to communicate on?
I think that certainly in London there is a real distrust of the development process. I think often people's experience of development is they see kind of big kind of new luxury homes go up that are sold to people outside of their community, and they're feeling like they're being pushed out of their community. And there are really good developers, and we've got great partnerships with Argent, but the the pattern of what's happening in London at the moment is the city is hollowing out. We have now the lowest birth rate in the country in Camden. We have in London over 160,000 people living in temporary accommodation, 1 in 23 children. And people don't understand why homes aren't being built that they can afford, that allow them to stay in their places. And I think part of that is we are not seeing enough national investment in council housing and affordable homes, so that we can't deliver what our communities want. But that frustration kind of sits with the whole development process, and you get deep distrust. And also I think where development isn't really looking at places, green spaces, schools, well-being, the real investment in placemaking, again, people see it as happening to them and not with them. I was talking to a young woman the other day about development, and she's like, I don't want to look out of a window of my estate and see a new community spring up that has nothing for me.
I think it's absolute typical of Georgia's leadership that she has a birth rate problem in Camden. Decides to get pregnant.
I know, yeah.
Well done. That's true leadership.
Saving those schools one child at a time.
Got to keep those schools going. I was interested that you talked about planning. And I think both Abby and George have indicated that there's maybe a lack of understanding about the importance of local government and local authorities in their lives. But what do you think the images of planners, and what do you think the images of your trade? I've got to confess, seems like a very nice and sober event, but I have in the past been to MIPIM.
Yeah. Hashtag MIPIM lads.
Hashtag pretty wild. And I must admit, I came away thinking I didn't see much sort of commitment to social justice through the housing and planning system there.
Yeah. Fair point.
So what's your sense of the image of your trade?
Well, the problem is our trade is pretty wide. So people look at the word property developer and see all kinds of different actors, right? So our company gets involved in places and builds and owns and stays there for 15, 20, 25 years. I've personally been involved in King's Cross for 23 years. That's quite different from turning up a place, building some houses and leaving again.
Right.
And I think what I'd like to see is the system, whatever that means, actually start to encourage our kind of development, whether that's through taxation or the way land is priced or whatever. So those long-term development owner-operator models are encouraged rather than the build and bugger off model, which is actually, I think, almost incentivized at the moment through the system. So you're right, I think public trust in the development process is pretty low. That's part of the problem. And it is in planning too. I'm pro-planning, and planners are not really the main problem here. But the one thing I will say about planning is that the government...
Do you think both government and opposition at the moment are talking about freeing up the planning system? Do you think they're picking the wrong ball?
Every government for the last 25 years says they're going to make it quicker, faster, simpler, and better. And they tinker with it endlessly. The one thing about the planning system now that I will criticise is that it's teed up, everything's teed up as a giant negotiation. So the public reads in a plan that they're going to have X thousand homes, 40% affordable, schools, whatever. And then they expect that to be delivered. That's their reasonable expectation from reading a plan that's taken years to push through the system. But those of us who are in the system know that that's not going to happen. What happens is there's a giant negotiation around every aspect of that. And then what gets delivered is a different thing. And that's corrosive. That does erode people's faith in the system. So I think we either abandon plan-led or we actually go back to it, which is my preference, and actually have plans that actually mean something. And I think that could help restore trust.
Can I sort of get into this central question, which is, why is it that all governments for 25, 40 years have talked about making planning quicker and easier, and they don't succeed in doing it? And before I come to you, I'm going to probably start with you. And what's your sense of why every time a government says we're going to make planning easier, it never quite happens?
So I've got a theory that all MPs are actually frustrated local councillors, in a way. Because the reality is that this is where the excitement is, isn't it? People will say to you, I don't know about Georgia, but certainly have said to me over the years, don't you really want to be an MP? Why? What power does my MP have today that I don't have as leader of the council? In fact, they have no power. They have 3 people who work for them in an office. They have no money to spend on anything within their area, and actually have no real ability to influence things in a very direct way.
No real ability, full stop.
Speaks from experience,
And And I think that's the tension, isn't it, in a way, that there is certainly at the moment a pressure within the system that wants MPs to be kind of glorified local councillors. And there's been a lot of discussion around the localisation of MPs, signing off your levelling up fund bid and all that sort of stuff, which in effect means that they're trying to be like me and Georgia. But actually, me and Georgia, and we've got the power to do these things. And hence, their frustration at not getting stuff done is kind of then wanting to redo the system for us.
Thank you. Georgia, thoughts on why governments never really succeed in making planning simpler and easier, despite their repeated statements that that's what they're going to do?
We were having a discussion last night about this, and I think sometimes when the government's talking about place and devolution being important, but what they mean by that is we're going to have more people talking about place and devolution at the centre rather than putting the delivery powers into the hands of places and leaders like ours. So we were just discussing around land assembly. We don't really have the powers we need around land assembly, compulsory purchase, land value, being able to capture some of the value that's created in our places. In New York, 50% of the taxation created there is kept by the city. In London, it's 7%.
Wow.
Yeah, and we are such a centralised country. So unless we're given the levers at a local level to really kind of lead economic transformation, including the planning system, we will never see a change.
Just on your point, Abby, about you have more power in your locality than an MP. So, Georgia, you tried to become an MP a while back, and it didn't happen, and you're now the council leader. Would you actually think that what you do now is better for politics and better for and how do you sort of weigh the two up now? Do you still want to be an MP?
Yeah, I mean, I was 23. We all have things we do when we're young. That was my youthful rebellion.
Yeah.
No, I mean, absolutely. Being a councillor and now council leader has been the best thing I've ever done because place gives a connection point between communities, the public services, businesses, and you can come together and make real transformation. You have such convening power, and there's never. It's been a really hard 10, 12 years. But I never lose hope and optimism because we are delivering every day and changing lives. So I think local government is where the leadership and change is happening. And you saw that during the pandemic. Like billions were wasted on that test and trace system. And then when all the money was spent, government came to us as councils and said, can you help? And we had the relationships to be able to drive that change. But I think that is where I started. There's a really exciting conversation, I think, going on, particularly in the Labour Party, but also in the Conservative Party
and
about
Abby,
devolution.
And on this devolution point, so you had in Stoke-on-Trent, I mean, you had an elected mayor for a while, and then that clearly didn't catch on because then you got rid of it. Is that cynicism and apathy? Is it because they didn't do a very good job? How do you actually win the message that we need more devolution when there have been so many instances where governments try to give it, like we did with the Northern Assembly, for example, and the public just go, nah, not bothered?
I think it's about aiming at the things that people want, but the pace of change is too slow, isn't it? The government have set out a framework of 3 levels of devolution. Well, what if you don't fit into one of those 3? Stoke-on-Trent doesn't fit into one of those 3. Just
unbundle that, explain that.
So in the Levelling Up white paper, there are 3 different levels that you can go for with elected mayors at certain points. But Stoke-on-Trent's a really good example. We've had an elected mayor in the past. It didn't go down terribly well. I don't think there's any political appetite to necessarily go back to that. But you need to take the public on that journey. But if that's the only, if the government is laying out a journey and actually you're saying, but that's not the road I want to go on, I think it's a slightly different one. How do you get there?
So what would be good? What would be the form of devolution for Stoke-on-Trent that you would like?
So one of the levels of devolution that I was aiming for, it was my own created level because again that's back to the agency of local government. I don't believe that I'm here as a council leader to do what the government tells me. Rishi does not phone me up and say, Abby, this is what you should be doing, and Boris didn't, and nobody else did either, in a way. So actually what you're trying to do is say, I know my place better than you do. I do know my place better than you do, Whitehall, and this is what we want. So for Stoke-on-Trent, it would be an integrated transport authority, and it might move on to that as you get there. But getting to that is so hard. It took me 4 years to get to the point of getting the government to say, actually, I understand what you're after. And of course, then the electorate decides, actually, we really don't like that for whatever reason.
Someone help me understand, what's the point of the Mayor of London? Because it's
sorry. Says the man who ran for the job.
Yeah.
I mean, you
could have worked that out.
Exactly.
What was the point of her standing then?
No, in the process of standing for it. So I stood to be Mayor of London, and I found it very, very, very weird. So on the one hand, theoretically, you were responsible for the police, for transport, and to some extent for development. But the truth was, whenever you saw Sadiq Khan standing up, what he was basically saying is, I don't really control any of those things, and I'm being unfairly blamed for the fact that the signalling doesn't work on the Piccadilly line and this and the other. And when you got onto development and housing, it was really, really weird. Because whenever I got in a room with somebody like Georgia, I got the distinct impression that Georgia thought she was running it, not the Mayor of London, right? So could someone explain, particularly when it comes to housing and development, what is the point of the Mayor of London when the local councils really feel that they're the people driving it?
I think you need both. You need regional government and local government to work together. And sometimes we get into a big thing about who's got the most power, but actually you need your 33 London boroughs, which including the city, which I chair, and the Mayor of London to have a plan together. And we can deliver. We own a lot of land, and we can actually deliver a lot of that housing. The TfL have a huge estate, and one public estate, and working together, we can bring far more forward. But I think if you need a regional capacity to do some of those big things.
So public accountability.
Yeah,
you're really cross about the fact there's not enough affordable housing in London, and you as the citizen are trying to find someone to kick. And there's all these different things. There's your local borough, there's the chair of the boroughs, there's the Mayor of London. Who are you supposed to blame for the fact that the
Tories.
affordable housing is...
Can I chip in?
Always blame the Tories.
Yeah.
I mean, probably right. I mean,
Whoa. Whoa.
this is being recorded.
I'm demob happy. I'm so tired, but more of that later. I'll talk about that later. I think I remember when we didn't have a mayor. I remember when we were starting King's Cross, for example, and the first mayor, Livingston, was coming in. I mean, London, before we had that, I won't give you a complete answer, I don't think, but I think it's been really important to have a mayor. It does give a focus to the city. I think actually this whole point of a sort of a narrative and vision for the city is really important. And investors do look for that. You want to see a vision and buy into it and look at leadership and see capacity. And I think that's important. And we all know that one person can't decide everything, but the mayor does have subtle levers to prod and pull and nudge in all sorts of areas. He doesn't build the homes. I mean, Georgia doesn't build the homes. You've got private developers, you've got registered providers, you've got a whole gamut of people. But the mayor does have grant, he has land, he has organisations like TfL, he has some moral authority, and is a leader in London. And I think it has been important. I think if I compare it to the period when we didn't have that, and we just had the 33 boroughs all doing their thing, it was a complete mess in comparison. So I think, it is a much better situation now. One person can't do everything, but I do think it gives a focus, and it does actually is part of the coordination. It's a very complicated sort of organism, I think, just planning and development in London. But I've seen, the mayor can change policy on something, and it takes 5 years to end up in the plan, but the industry almost reacts to it overnight. And you see the whole thing shifting, and it's incredibly subtle, but I do think it largely works.
But to build homes, you need a massive national mission, and you need all levels of government to work together. You need central government to give long-term investment, to give confidence. You need regional government, the Mayor of London or the Mayor of Manchester, to support capacity, have a kind of citywide plan, understand, what are the big investable sites, and you need boroughs who know their communities to really deliver those homes, and you need all to be working together.
Abby, you secured the biggest single levelling up fund, what do we call it, allocation? First of all, I want to ask you whether you actually think, now that you maybe can be a bit more objective because the electorate decided, despite that amazing success, not to keep you on, is there a real levelling up strategy at national level? How do you define it? And is there not something a bit weird about you guys all having to essentially compete for a limited fund and the decisions are taken somewhere else? I mean, is that not just a kind of mission impossible from both ends of that equation?
Yeah, absolutely. We were talking beforehand about Stoke-on-Trent and kind of what it needs, and it needs everything in a way. No political party has been successful in addressing the needs of Stoke-on-Trent, and whatever levelling up is called by whichever government, it has to happen in places like Stoke-on-Trent. When I got on the train yesterday to come here, I left behind 2 massive cranes on the skyline. That is one of our Levelling Up Fund projects that's underway, and it was a project that was going to happen anyway. The cash coming in has made it go even faster. But there are others that are kind of along the way to getting there. And whilst, yeah, absolutely, I'm so proud of the amount of cash that I managed to bring in over 4 years. It's only building things, and levelling up has to be more than building things.
Mm-hmm.
We were talking about some of the awful statistics in Stoke-on-Trent. You're more likely to die before the age of 2. You're not going to live as long as other people. You're going to suffer from industrial diseases. You're going to have childhood and adult obesity. You're not going to do as well at school. You're unlikely to go to university. You're probably not going to earn as much money as people elsewhere. And whilst that project that I left behind will start to address some elements of that in terms of jobs and things like that, what it isn't going to do is some of the other stuff. And my personal frustration, despite having a plan that addressed the 4 things that I thought were the biggest priority, is that around public health and equality, it's really, really hard to get the government to see that you need everything. The projects are great, but it has to be about people too, and there is only there is no capacity within that window for bidding for levelling up funds that say, actually, you can spend some of that on addressing things to do with people's lives. And ultimately, that's what you need to check.
So is there actually a levelling up strategy?
I don't think there is, if I'm honest. I think it's a really catchy slogan that has been really great for places like Stoke in terms of bringing the cash in. But again, it's back to nobody understands my place as well as I understand my place. You can't determine the future of Stoke-on-Trent from Whitehall. You can only do that from in Stoke-on-Trent and by giving us the opportunities to develop out with that.
I mean, the white paper now feels quite a long time ago, because obviously government's changed and all the rest of it, but it's actually worth going back to that white paper, if you can face it. Because, and Section 2, I applaud Section 2, right, which is basically the analysis of the system. I think it's really good. It actually talks about the devolution, the importance of longer-term funding. It analyses why the system isn't working and correctly identifies all those issues. I think Section 2, or Chapter 2, whatever, of the white paper is a really clever analysis of why it's not working. It's just that no one reads that bit. They all read the bit about all the proposals at the end, which now feel a little bit out of date. But the analysis of the system is really good. And I just think, I've lost my train of thought, which is probably because I've just cycled 400 kilometres from London to Paris.
I've
been dying to get that in.
It's plug the charity.
We raise money for Royal Marsden Cancer Charity. 50 of us from related Argent cycled to Paris. We arrived yesterday, so we flew in last night. So if I miss my words there, then you'll forgive me for feeling absolutely knackered.
It's deep,
anyway.
deep.
Sorry, but I was going to say that, I remembered now. But also, in the white paper, they identified 12 missions. And I think, again, the 12 missions are the right mission. They talk about all the physical things, and the leadership, and the pride of place, and skills, and health, and inequality. And actually, the 12 missions, I can't find fault with the 12 missions. I think the issue is how you deliver them. That's the bit in the white paper that feels out of date. But the analysis of what's wrong, and the analysis of the missions for levelling up, I thought was spot on.
Well, unfortunately, this is the case with everything. I mean, basically, governments all over the world, not just a problem with Tory governments, are very good at analysing the problems and find it very difficult coming up with a solution. But one of the solutions that all of you have been talking about is longer-term, more predictable funding from the government. Can you explain in detail what does that actually look like? Does that involve the Treasury saying, I am committing £1 billion to Stoke over the next 15 years? Or, I mean, what is it? What would it feel like?
Part of it's just longer term. So, for example, the government is able to fund things on a long-term basis, certain infrastructure, high-speed 2, nuclear defence, nuclear power, and so on. It hasn't managed it for, say, housing. And that's because housing is so political that no government feels it can buy in the hands of future administrations. But we need a long-term infrastructure type of approach to housing. And we need more funding to be allocated and then not to be micromanaged and controlled from Whitehall.
Can I drill into this? Because I think this is a fundamental problem. It's the exception, not the rule, where government provides 15, 20-year funding.
It is, yeah.
Because, as you say, it stops the next government being able to spend the money. If you've pre-committed the Treasury budget, new Labour government comes in, they're like, this is completely crazy.
Yeah.
We've got no flexibility over our budget. These idiots before us spent it all over the next 20 years.
The counter-argument is we have a crisis in housing, we have a crisis in climate change, we need to somehow get back to growth. We've had no real growth in the country for 20 years. We've got a very short window to get to net zero. and an opportunity to try and find a new path for growth that aligns with that. And we haven't hit our housing targets for God knows how many years. So I would say the situation demands a complete rethink. And you're right, it's not the way we do most of things, but the current system doesn't work, so let's change it.
But, we're talking, local government get 1 year settlements. 5 years would be amazing. And I think that there's over 100 different kind of regen growth pots that we're all competitively bidding into. We calculate it takes between 25k to 140k to put in a bid. Often we don't get it. It's such a waste of resource. And if you compare that to the work we're doing, Marvin Rees, the Mayor of Bristol, who's in the front there, is chair of core cities, and we've been working as London councils and core cities on what would it take to decarbonise all of our cities, the 12 biggest economic cities outside of London. 206 billion investment opportunity. We're working on kind of deeply working with the private sector on economic models. And yet we're still having to do these tiny little bids. If they could give us some certainty, even over the next 5 years, of the money what they want to put into retrofit, we could then bring in huge investment from the private sector to decarbonise our buildings that would make the biggest impact on climate, but also mean that my residents don't have to choose between eating and heating their homes.
Rory and I interviewed recently, it's coming out in a few weeks, Kate Raworth, Donut Eco.
Oh, yeah.
And I think we both struggled with her concept, but you've mentioned growth. We all talk about growth and meeting all the sort of needs, people's needs, and trying to grow the economy. But her basic argument is that growth is a kind of false obsession.
Well, only at the edge. As I understand it, her book is that there's a band in the middle, hence the donut. So there's a level you
Where
need
we thrive.
There's a level you need to get into the donut, and there's an edge to the donut.
Right, and these are like minimum things that we should all be entitled to.
Yeah.
But where we've all gone is to an obsession
Growth
with
per se.
growth and wealth.
Yeah.
And consumption.
I do agree with that, because
Do you?
we've been pushing growth. I think we need economic growth, and the problem that Britain has is that we talk about economic growth all the time, and we are not growing.
Yeah.
And I think if we had a kind of wider conception of growth, which is sustainable, which has the well-being of citizens built in, actually we would grow so much faster, because it's not productive to have so many people with mental health issues and deep inequality. They're not contributing or able to contribute to entrepreneurialism.
So Kate Raworth's stuff is much, much, much more radical.
Yeah, no, I know.
She's arguing that we're already exceeding the planetary footprint.
Yes.
That we're 1.2 times larger than we need to be. And that to achieve equity across the world, you would have to shrink the size of the British economy by 75% in order to put us in the right position for climate change, environment. She's not into...
I've read her stuff. I meant the point about the obsession with growth as an output on its own.
Right.
Yeah.
But you then went on to say that if we thought about it better, we could have even more growth. She doesn't want even more growth.
She wants less.
She wants less growth. She wants us to shrink.
Yeah, no, I think we need to grow. I think the problem with many of our cities...
How do you balance that with her saying we can't afford to grow? If our societies, our economies continue to grow, the planet's got finite resources.
But I talked about a new market that we want to...
Infinite growth is not compatible
But it's partly
with a planet with finite resources.
It's partly what you're measuring, isn't it? But it's also, the basic problem we have in this country is productivity. So productivity, if you look at UK cities, so the 8 biggest cities in the UK, you take London out of it, they sit behind the average. Whereas in every other European country, big cities lead the average.
But it's also how you grow, right? So I just talked about the potential around retrofit. There's a model of growth where we shape a new market, create hundreds of thousands of jobs, retrofit our buildings, and reduce the impact on the climate. So it's the kind of growth that I think that we're aiming for, and I think that's where we have to be much more strategic if we are serious about net zero.
Let me give one more push on this.
Go for it.
Because if you're actually a radical climate activist, you don't really believe in green growth because you don't believe the planet can tolerate more growth. It doesn't matter whether the growth is coming from retrofitting. Doesn't matter whether the growth is coming from whatever. In the end, the idea is that the planet cannot afford to maintain the kind of lifestyles that we currently live in the West. And if that's true, how on earth is it possible for elected politicians to communicate? If it turned out to be true, that's her challenge. Right? So it's a difficult hypothetical. Alastair and I really struggle with this. We have no idea how you would say to a voter, if it were true, that we actually have to shrink
the planning system really isn't our biggest problem, is it? So.
What is it? What's not our biggest problem?
The planning system is not our biggest problem.
No. Abby, what do you when you see? Are you still a Conservative? Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Despite you lobbying.
You were
me to
working
be,
on that
yeah.
earlier.
It
Yeah,
hasn't
that's
changed
right.
in the course of a panel.
Yeah, okay.
She doesn't just
want-
met you and become Labour.
No. It has happened. You see that?
Do you want to sit here?
I just think she's so nice and pleasant and clever, and
You'll find that's in local government. We work together, you know.
Yeah, but anyway. But when you see the Conservative government nationally, and the sort of, so they obviously, when you see people like Suella Braverman and Lee Anderson, all this culture war stuff that they push, what have you, they would argue, not to mention Gullis, your local MP, they would argue that they are sort of, speaking to a politics that they believe the people of places like Stoke-on-Trent want. Now, am I wrong to think they're profoundly wrong about that?
I'd just like to say Jonathan Gullis is not actually my MP. He's one of our MPs in Stoke-on-Trent.
Is he as bad as he seems?
The reality is, though, that I go and knock on doors and talk to people who express the same frustrations that Jonathan says, and I'm very upfront with the fact that yes, I speak to Jonathan, and he the way he and I would talk about things is not necessarily in the same way.
You wouldn't call your voters scrotes?
No, no. But he does know, and he does tease me quite a lot because I do. I'm a vegetarian, and I run, and that clearly doesn't fit within his paradigm of what I should be doing in my spare time. But the reality is that in a city like Stoke-on-Trent, we have had one of the highest concentrations of asylum seekers within the country. Now, one of the biggest challenges that I faced as leader was how you navigate your way through a city that's incredibly challenged, where people are really struggling on a day-to-day basis, but they can see people coming into the city. And whilst there isn't necessarily a direct impact on the council in terms of us having to pay for things, there is clearly a wider impact. So, we've got 2 hotels stood up at the moment, and it's meant that basically there is no free school places in the city. The local authority is now having to pay to take children into school. There's a massive pressure around that, receiving phone calls from some of our local agencies around people wondering, going in and saying, how can you help us? And one of my biggest challenges is how do I navigate my way through this without, I'm a mum. I've been to both the hotels within the city, and I've seen them, and I found it incredibly moving and compassionate the way that people were being supported in my city. But I also go and knock on doors of families who are really struggling as well. And how do you navigate your way through that system as a politician, let alone a Conservative politician, where you feel that it's incredibly unfair that you were the only place within 100 miles that is taking asylum seekers? None of the other districts around us were. In fact, across the West Midlands, we were one of only 7 local authorities who were a dispersed asylum area. How's that fair that my city, that's already really struggling, that's got so many challenges, is having to bear that burden, but my neighbours elsewhere don't have to be part of that? And to challenge my own government on that and say, this isn't fair, and I see myself as a Conservative, that then creates a problem for the government, because they've got lots of other places that talk about how unfair that is, but they're not taking anyone. But we are.
But you have exactly the same problem, don't you? You have a lot of asylum seekers. You've got hotels that have been given over to them, and you've got local communities that feel... But is it because you're in a bigger place, it's easier to kind of... I don't know, how have you...
I think that... Well, sometimes people talk about poor councils, and then I'm like, well, what about the Home Office? Because I think the Home Office and how they've handled the placement of people across the country has been appalling, with no warning, not working alongside communities. And we have many people waiting for years for asylum, and they're not allowed to work. They're not allowed to contribute, which I think is completely wrong. I mean, in Camden, we had 2,000 Afghan refugees, and and some have been placed elsewhere, but we'll find homes for everyone to settle as part of our community. And I think there's been a real strength in Camden around that kind of welcome, around working alongside people, around kind of absorbing that diversity and seeing this as a new community that adds something. But I think that there's a fundamental issue that the level of asylum that we're seeing at the moment exposes, which is the whole housing market is broken, because the government are just struggling so hard to place people, because there's nothing in Camden in central London that sits underneath the housing benefit cap. We did a search around the whole country and we couldn't find a 4-bedroom anywhere that sat under the housing benefit cap. Now that is as true for somebody in temporary accommodation in Camden as it is for somebody seeking asylum. So I think we have to come to terms with the housing crisis to be able to kind of deal with the concerns that our communities do have.
Rob, do you want to say?
Yeah, I was going to say, one of the things we did at King's Cross is set up a primary school, an academy. So one of the primary schools in Camden is an academy that I chair. So we've taken some of the children from Afghan refugees, as a number of schools have. And actually, it's really impressive how the support network has been developed in that part of London, all locally based. I mean, the government has literally just dropped the people and kind of walked away. But actually, a real sort of local support network has come into play, and it has worked, and it's quite sort of diffuse, but it's all locally based, and actually, it has actually, I think, worked incredibly well. But I don't want to draw a clunky point to something that was raised earlier, but I think the problem is people are actually very supportive of these things until they see that the sort of money and things that would make it work don't come with it. And I think, in a way, it is a little bit like the question earlier Rory raised about development. I think people would be more pro-development if they saw that it led to better roads, better schools, better healthcare, better school places, better. But the truth is, in most cases, it's the opposite. They see it as more pressure on those things, less resources, and a spiral the other way. But I think to change the dynamic around people's perception of these things, they just need to be backed up and resourced properly.
Can I come back to you? And so you've heard all this, Camden, London. Can I give you one more chance to talk about why the Stoke experience might be different from what you've just heard?
So I think, the point to make is that Stoke has been an asylum dispersal area since the very beginning, and I'm really proud actually of how many people have come to my brilliant city and been welcomed, and we've got a diverse population as a result. But the issue then comes down, I think, in a way, what we've just heard, that there is additional pressure there in the system. When I went to the hotels a few days before Christmas, and while we were there, people from the local areas were bringing parcels in for the families. And I walked into the hall of one of them, and there was a long trestle table laid out with all the presents there. And rather bizarrely, they thought we were going to hand the presents out, and I was like, no, that's not what I'm here for. I'm just kind of here to see what's happening and to talk to the people who were running the hotels and to understand what they thought their role was, which was to make sure people were okay, but also to help them to acclimatise to life in this totally strange country where you didn't know people. And you can't leave that and not feel really strongly about how well that's been delivered, albeit I'm entirely with Georgia, and we both sat in meetings together talking to the Home Office about largely how the plan hasn't worked. But then to go outside and, there is, conversations, and I heard them, and people would approach me in the supermarket say, I've heard in these hotels, and it's this and it's that, and there's a gym, and there's all this. And the reality is that isn't actually happening. But in a place where people can't afford, car ownership in Stoke-on-Trent is one in 3 people do not have access to a car, and that's not because public transport is amazing, it's because they cannot afford to run a car. So when they then hear about people in 2 really prominent hotels who they think have got access to a gym, to, basically an all-inclusive holiday in Stoke-on-Trent, which probably doesn't sound as good as it ought to. But you know what I mean? Unsurprisingly, that kind of then really starts to get into those spaces.
Yeah, but the Gullises of this world and the Lee Andersons and the Bravermans, they don't challenge that mythology. They ventilate it for political gain. That's the problem.
Yeah.
Shall we start going out to you guys a bit? Can we do a little? Rory and I love to do shows of hands with our audiences. We did one in Harrogate last night, and we asked 2 questions, and I'm going to ask the same to you. First is, we're going to give you a choice of 3 options for who's going to be in power in 2 years' time. Keir Starmer's going to be in Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, or somebody other than those 2, okay? And then the second question which Rory always likes to ask...
I will ask.
Okay. I'll go with So I'll go first. So you've got Starmer, Sunak, somebody else, okay? Who thinks Keir Starmer will be Prime Minister in 2 years? Wow. Who thinks Rishi Sunak will be? Who thinks somebody else will be? Interesting.
You need to ask, will Starmer be Prime Minister in a coalition?
Or on his own, yeah.
Yes.
No, I don't.
I think that would be a more interesting question.
Okay, all right. George wants to ask a question. George, ask your question.
Yeah, who thinks that Keir will lead a coalition?
Probably.
And on his own? And now Rory
Mixes
wants
it
Okay,
up.
now, so my question is, who in the room knows what Keir Starmer's 5 missions are?
Marvin, if you don't know, we're in trouble here. Georgia?
Health, safety, opportunity, growth.
No.
It is. NHS,
Yeah,
growth,
that's just an issue. It's not the
safety.
mission. What's
Yeah,
the mission?
Okay, so excluding elected Labour politicians,
Who don't know?
how many people in this room could provide a clear description of what Keir Starmer's economic policy is going to be?
It's not good, is it?
It's not
Not
good.
good.
It's not good. And I guess my anxiety is, as a kind of now a floating voter, an independent floating voter, is I feel we're very, very close to the election. And 2 years before the election in '97, Tony Blair, New Labour, were projecting a very, very clear idea of the kind of Britain they were going to run. And they were getting into the details, and they were being quite radical and quite bold about explaining what that was going to feel like. And I was reminded of this. We did an interview on the podcast with Alan Milburn, who's one of my heroes. And one of the extraordinary things with him is just how incredibly sort of blunt and clear and intelligent he was about reform to the NHS and unapologetic about things that are very controversial, the place of the private sector in the NHS and all this kind of stuff. Whereas it feels to me that Labour at the moment is following what you'd call a Ming Vase strategy. They're trying to carry themselves across the line without really taking any risk or signalling anything bold.
So Rory,
2 years ago, 2 years before '97, the Labour were in a very different position. So I think Keir had a big job to do to actually to make the Labour Party in a place that anyone would listen to what they had to say.
Does that not worry you that these people who are clearly, pretty intelligent, pretty well read, follow the stuff, right? But they don't know what the Labour Party wants to do in power. So what that says to me is they think the Tories are terrible, we want to get rid of the Tories, and that's going to happen, but they don't have a clear sense of what's going to come. That's a problem.
And I think it's starting to come. Today, we were just discussing before, there was a kind of quite a brave announcement around planning and the
Rob's
Green
told us
Belt.
that's not the big issue.
that's my view. So could you
and so I think that we are, through the missions, and they've just come.
I think we should let Rory explain the missions.
Go on.
I have no hope at all explaining these missions. I mean, one of them is around the rule of law, which I find very, very, very disturbing. So you may have seen these posters it was on Twitter. Do you think that people who sexually assault children should go to jail? Rishi Sunak doesn't. And then at the bottom, 4,300 people who sexually assaulted children were not sent to jail this year. The implication being that if Labour came in, they would change that. Those 4,300 people would go to jail. Now, our prisons are already entirely overcrowded. We've got 82,000 people living in prisons built for 65,000. We've got people in Victorian cells built for 2 people crammed into them. And this man was the director of public prosecutions. He knows that those 4,000 people who were not sent to jail because judges who had gone into these cases in detail concluded these did not merit jail sentences. And he is signaling a completely irresponsible criminal justice policy that goes against his entire professional life and education in order to scoop up votes. And I think it's disgusting.
Okay.
I agree.
Right, okay. Abby, can I just ask you, Rory's slightly off topic there, but it's, all right, it's allowed.
Yeah. Was that the mission?
It was one of the missions.
Okay.
Abby, does Stoke-on-Trent, you've lost the council, but does Stoke-on-Trent feel like it's going back to Labour? Does it feel like that, or do you think there's actually...
I think to a degree it's going back to Labour. I think the frustration of being a Conservative who kind of has come from nowhere to being, as somebody described me the other day, poster girl kind of thing for the rise of red wall Conservatives, is that a few years ago, 2010, the headline in the local paper was about UKIP taking control, and the reality is that Stoke-on-Trent has incrementally become more and more Conservative over time, to the point we've got 3 Conservative MPs now. Whether we will hold those or not, I think is debatable, but do I see a decline? No. So, I may have lost control of the council, but we actually have only lost 1 seat versus where we were in 2019. So second best ever result for the Conservatives in Stoke-on-Trent. So it is, but it isn't. I think, some of my dubiousness, I guess, is on the same point that you've just made around what does it all mean. So, the campaign locally was around freezing council tax. Well, that's not actually within our gift, or it is, but that's massive amount of savings to be made. And again, do people know what they really voted for? I think I said to you before, neither party has had the right answer on Stoke-on-Trent, and I'm not sure they have in the future either. My government has no more idea than I think Labour has around how you really solve the issues, whether it's levelling up or whatever you call it.
Right, let's take some questions. Yes, sir, shout out.
You asked Rory whether the audience knew the 5 pillars
Yep.
of the Labour policy.
Yep.
We didn't ask, does anyone agree or even know one pillar of the current government policies with which they really are in accord?
Very good. Well, let's firstly, does anyone have any idea of what Rishi Sunak's economic policy is?
Stop the boats.
Very good. Okay, so we have a...
Clusters.
So it's a really good. So we have a problem, which is that we have a government that apparently has no vision and clarity and an opposition that apparently has no vision and clarity. Very good. Let's take a question then. Please, yeah. Rental reform bill, Georgia.
I'm looking at you.
Old Rob, Abby.
You can go first.
I'll let you go first.
Well, I've been on a bike. I haven't read it, so... what I do know is that we're increasingly doing rental housing. So we started life as a commercial developer, then got more into housing. We're now getting big time into build to rent, so professionally managed rental housing. It's going to be a huge part of our business. So, the only concern I would have about it is just, obviously, we need capital to come into the sector, and anything which scares that off could be an issue. But I'm not saying it does. I haven't really followed it in detail, but I think at the moment it does look as if there is a case for better regulation of it. And I think most professional owners and managers would welcome, a sort of higher minimum standard. But the only thing to watch from our point of view is just making sure we carry, the investors with us, because we need a huge amount of capital to come into that sector to make it happen.
Right at the top there.
So there's been so much talk about boosting funding. Where's the money going to come from? Other sector capital, what compromises are going to be made? In local government taxation. What's central government going to give? I was just wondering if you guys use taxes.
And also, you're all three committed to the idea of further devolution. Would that include greater tax-raising powers away from Westminster?
Possibly. For example, in the States, there's a lot of cities can raise their own finance. They have green bonds, for example, something we've been looking at through Opportunity London. Where the city actually, it is a different fiscal base, but they raise funding for specific renewable and carbon projects. And they attract private sector funding on that basis. But of course, the city has an income stream which it can borrow against. And the history of that in the UK was not particularly pretty. And of course, it got cancelled because it went wrong. But I do think, in the right circumstances, that could work.
Abby, would you?
So, yes, but I think, the challenge is really, Rory said earlier, explain in detail local government finance. Wow, we haven't really got time, have we? But the inherent challenge is that if you then connect local electorate to the money that they raise, places like Stoke are always going to be left behind because the tax base is so low that, yes, from a democratic principle, it's great, isn't it, to think exactly what the pound you are paying for is going to provide. But in some places of the country, you're just going to get further and further left behind. And for a Conservative, I've always believed that I need to be an interventionist as well. Where do I need to step in, because the market is not going to fix everything? So where is your place around that? So I think it's kind of that balance. I think there are elements. My big ask around the Integrated Transport Authority, clearly if you're going to get one of those, then you're going to have to ask residents to pay for it. But there are some bits that, 1% in council tax in Stoke-on-Trent, an increase raises something like £800,000. That's absolutely nothing. In Croydon, I think it's about £2 million for 1% on council tax. So, you're not really going anywhere, and the level of council tax increase you'd have to raise at the moment.
So what would you say to our Antipodean friend?
I think you have to be pragmatic around this. I think there is, it's a good idea to connect the two together, but it also has to be proportionate, doesn't it? And we, to a degree, we're back to the challenge of local authorities playing each other off, and within the context within which you're comparing, you can never compare someone like Stoke-on-Trent to even Manchester or Birmingham, let alone London. And you know, do the public out there have enough awareness of some of that?
I mean, yeah, if Camden was allowed to keep all of our taxes, we would have absolute gold-plated services, and I would never advocate for that, because we absolutely need to redistribute. And when we're talking about funding, we're talking about long-term settlements. Some of that will need to be redistributed around the country. But if London was allowed to capture more of the value created there, there'd be more public investment available for places like Stoke. So to give an example, HS2, which is left a massive hole in the middle of my borough at the moment. You're dealing with a government around that. It's short-term conversations with the Department for Transport. There's huge value to be created at Euston with some initial investment, and that we could kind of claw that back in business rates and increased income over the long term that could be invested in our communities, and we have some of the poorest communities in the country right next to Euston, but also to be invested in Stoke. So I think, looking at land value capture models, looking at online sales tax, looking at investment that saves money over the long term and brings in more value.
But I think your question's a very good one, because fundamentally there are going to be huge pressures on an incoming Labour government. They're already signalling immense promises to teachers, to hospitals, to the NHS, and they're also claiming they're going to try
Not really, they're not.
I thought we weren't saying anything.
Yeah.
And now we're making big promises.
So signalling.
But on-
I think if you're a teacher, a doctor,
Yeah,
you're
you think you can get
assuming
more,
that when the Labour government comes in, they're going to put your salaries up. And we certainly don't see them going out saying, we're not going to do that.
No,
right?
that's true.
But on this, Rory,
And they're also signalling being fiscally responsible, which is going to mean that finding huge amounts of public money for large investment in housing is going to be pretty tricky for them. Yeah.
Sorry, but I do think we can get more private sector money in too. I think the UK is in a challenging place because international investors are a bit more sceptical about the UK. But I do think there is more private money that can be brought in. And if you can lower the cost of that capital by pooling it and aggregating it and making it more long-term, I think there is a chance it could go further. At the moment, we all spend a huge amount of time attracting little pots of money to individual schemes and then worrying about liquidity and making sure all the land is tied up, and there's a huge amount of work done with lawyers on every agreement. There must be a better model where we aggregate more of these schemes, do things on a more longer-term fund basis. That is starting to happen. Some of you in the room are involved in some of these funds. And there is a way of sort of aggregating and just bringing the overall cost of capital down a notch. And that would mean more schemes that are currently unviable might be viable in the future.
Right.
It's worth a go.
Let's try and get. We've got 8 minutes left. Let's do lots of. You first. Yeah, shout out. We'll try and get through as many as we can.
Focusing this on housing, the government agenda focus on housing seems to be on the role is a revolving door. Government take housing seriously. Carbon accounts for a huge portion. Doesn't seem to be a big enough priority.
Well, that's.
Well, I mean, can I speak as somebody who was in these governments? Every single Prime Minister I worked under talked endlessly about housing. They were perpetually emphasising in every internal polling that we did that housing was going to be the key to a Conservative victory. David Cameron insisted on it, Theresa May insisted on it, Boris Johnson insisted on it, and every presentation we received was all about how we're going to lose the next election because we're not building enough houses. And housing targets were set again and again. And often these housing ministers were very, very talented high flyers who were put in and then were promoted quickly out of those roles to cabinet positions. Now, why is this happening? I think two things are happening. Firstly, the whole British system is screwed. So do understand that it's not just housing ministers that are being rotated all the time. Defence ministers, prisons ministers.
Prime ministers.
They're all being rotated all the time, right? So every single bit of government is protesting about the fact that ministers are only in for 6 months or 12 months at a time. That's a madness, the British system. But I think the other thing is that, as we've discovered again and again, every time the government really tried to push ahead, there was a massive backlash from citizens. And at some level, we've never been able to overcome the fact that a lot of our voters do not want these houses built, while another lot of voters do want houses.
Well, they all want them in theory, but not where they're going to be built. Yes, sir.
might be Prime Minister in 2 years.
Mm.
But I think the interesting question is who might be Prime Minister in 5 years. How does Labour
Well, I think by being very, very clear about a long-term plan, which is rooted in an explanation of the big challenges that the country faces. And my slight worry about this is 2 days in a row now, we've had exactly the same response from very different audiences. Last night was a very kind of general public thing, where they all, basically people think it's a done deal, Labour, the Tories are out, Labour are in, but we haven't got a clue what's going to happen. You can't govern for the long term unless the public are buying in, not just to getting rid of the other lot, but having a sense of clarity. Now, what I think about, we talked on the podcast today, the one that's just been released, about Keir's speech at the weekend, which I actually, don't know if you read it, I actually found it quite interesting, much more interesting than a lot of the speeches he's made, because I think he is beginning to put these longer term flags in the ground. But I still think to get over the line with the sort of majority you need to make real change without just sort of, doing deals here and there and bit of crisis management and all the stuff that you get with small majorities that we saw. Actually, the coalition, to be fair to them, handled it quite well, but you certainly saw with Theresa May, for example. I think to avoid that, you've got to give people a sense of this is where we've got to go. So it's got to be a long-term plan for the economy, for health, for education. It alarms me the extent to which education has sort of vanished from the debate. That was our big thing. That was our, education, number one priority. If I'm saying to Labour people, what is the number one priority? I do it all the time. They say different things. Some of them say housing. Some of them say health. Some of them say jobs. Some of them say cost of living. But what's the thing that we want Britain to feel like in 10 years' time? And that's whatever you put, whether people liked Tony and Gordon or didn't, we always knew that's where we were trying to get to. What I really like about Keir, though, is I think he's incredibly methodical about getting, so step by step, becoming leader of the Labour Party, sorting out the Corbynistas, showing the Tories are useless. Now, here's the policy, because he wants to win the election. And I think that it's a different approach, but you always need that long-term plan.
There's a hand that keeps going up here. Yeah.
Rory, I just, the way you went for London Marine, what would you have made your economic policy and your housing?
Well, I think it's easy to say as someone running for the position, but I think that Sadiq has been timid. I think there's a huge amount of transport for London land. There's a huge amount of land that he could have accessed and built. I think he could have been much more creative on funding. I think there were some very interesting things that he could have done about capturing value for future developments on Crossrail. I think there's a huge amount that he could have done to take power. I think one of the problems is that he's not asserting himself, that he's acting as a sort of ceremonial mayor. And that's partly because it suits him often to blame the Tories and the central government or the local councils rather than saying the buck stops here.
What was your slogan? You had a slogan. What was it again?
Oh, come on. Fair, green, united.
Yeah, what do you think of that?
London has just met our affordable housing targets. My borough's working in partnership with the mayor, I have to say.
That lady there.
What can you, in your various roles, what can we do to move trust?
Can I have a go at that?
What can we do to move trust?
trust
Yeah, do you want
forward.
trust, yeah. Oh, I mean, do you want to have a go at that?
He wants to have a go.
Oh, sorry.
No,
Rob.
I don't mind. Do you wanna...
Well, I'll start off. I think that, trust is low in politics in general, and often we have a system where, people are kind of shouting at each other from different perspectives, and we don't have spaces where people come together. And I think we need to invest in completely different models of doing democracy. So in Camden, we've run 10 citizens' assemblies where people from very different perspectives come and deeply deliberate issues and set policy. And we need to find mechanisms like that where communities are really leading and directing change and seeing what happens at the end of that. And whenever we run one of those, the kind of action and power that communities come out of it with really changes things. And I do think that Keir's missions, Labour's missions, are an opportunity to do that, to have a completely different conversation between state, citizens and communities. And if we can spend the next 6 months having that big public conversation so there is ownership, then you have a different route into government.
Wait, you were going to come in.
Well, no,
sorry,
I agree trust is really low in local government, actually, broadly, and in central government, and in our industry in particular.
It's higher in local government
Well,
than
I'm
it is
sure
in central government.
But my general point is that it's pretty low across the board, and certainly trust in our industry is pretty low. And I think the way Michael Gove has attacked the industry around the obvious issues around building regulations and fire safety and stuff hasn't helped. There's definitely an issue there we need to help own, but I think the way that he's sort of gone after the industry and made out that everybody's a kind of criminal has not been helpful, frankly. But I think the one thing we can do as an industry is we can go more towards that long-term development ownership, be in places model that I'm passionate about, so just better development. And I think also it's a really skilled sector. I think some of the problems that we've been hearing about today, our industry could be part of the solution. But we often don't stray into them because we see ourselves as built environment professionals. But I think we should just step into these places and be part of it. And I think that's broadly what I think could help. If we do great development, people will back development in the future.
I think there's a couple of things I would say on this. First is, I think politicians have got to do a much better job of standing up for politics. So like you've seen Abby and Georgia here on the platform today, from different parties, different perspectives, and nobody would think they were enemies. Whereas most of the politics that we see, this is why Rory and I do this podcast and the way that we try to do it, disagreeing agreeably we call it, I think people are just sick of the politics as it's done, and we've got to try and change that. The second thing is, never, ever, ever read the Daily Mail. Ever. Ever. And the final thing, Rory, I can't believe that you haven't just jumped in to say that there's a new book just been released. That
I was going to say, Alastair, you've got to read your book.
That answers this question.
It's actually amazing. And it's called But What Can I Do? And it's written by Alastair Campbell. And it's published this week.
Is it
and
number
it's
one?
number one.
Is it number one, Alastair?
It is, yes, it is. As of right.
Number one in the UK bestseller list.
Yeah.
So if you haven't got it, do please get it.
Right,
That's
lady.
Very final question. I think we've hit the hour, haven't we? Yeah.
Oh.
Okay, why don't we take very, very quick answer from all our three panelists, and then we're going to have to come to an end. We're going to let you go first.
No, I think it's where you were earlier, isn't it? That that's one part of society. But to go back to the earlier question, we need to be much braver. I think you see a huge amount of bravery in local authorities of all colours and none, talking about what the real issues are. And actually, we need to enable a wider conversation, whether it's about small boats, why it's about why regeneration doesn't happen in 20 minutes, why it takes time, and why that's important.
That's true. That statement is complete and utter nonsense. So,
Very good, Georgia.
Yeah, I mean, we've got 1 in 23 children in London who are facing homelessness. That's 1 in every classroom. The scale of the housing challenge we face is enormous, whether it's a young person trying to get on the housing ladder or the thousands of people we see on our waiting list. We are in complete crisis. And what the asylum housing issues have just shown is how stark that crisis is for those that we've been trying to welcome to the country from Afghanistan and for residents who've lived here for a long time.
But also, I heard that interview, and Fiona, my partner, said, do we still have to listen to John Redwood? It's like, this has gone on for decades now, talking absolute crap and being part of the reason we're in the mess. And this is what populism's about. This is populism. It's like they don't want to solve the problem. There's a problem. They want to exploit it politically. And that's what the Stop the Boats thing is about.
But it's dangerous and it causes hate in our communities.
Yeah, totally. So, you've depressed me now.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
There's a wave of local government leadership that's changing things.
Can I finish with a charity plug?
Please. He's going to finish a
charity plug. Yeah. If you've enjoyed today's event, or even if you haven't, frankly,
dig deep.
Can you please, if you'd like to, sponsor the Related Argent cycle to Paris? There's a hashtag Related Argent L2P. We're at 370,000 for the Royal Marsden. With your help, we can get a little bit closer to 400k today.
Oh, 500,000. Come on.
Come on. Thank you very much.
Ambition. Thank you. You done? You going?
Well done.